started, the genesis for this talk is some of the past experiences I had in one of my last roles, which was at US-CERT. One caveat is it is a bit of critique and criticism of some things, but ideally it should be about the lessons learned, right? What went wrong and how can we collectively as a community do better about information sharing. Briefly about me, I was the chief of the incident response program for US-CERT. For about 7 years, I built and oversaw that incident response program. US-CERT moved from being pretty much a coordination element, receive reports in, disseminate information, into actually doing incident response, deploying teams in the field. And that included for both government victims as well as private sector critical infrastructure. After a while of doing that sort of thing, you quickly begin to realize the value of being proactive rather than reactive so that you can save yourself a lot of time. So that was an evolution for myself on that front. Previously, time in the private sector, RSA, AOL and the Time Warner companies, and then started out as a Unix sysadmin in a university environment. And if you ever want to learn how not to secure a system, put some students in front of it. They'll teach you real quick. All right, well, so I call this the infamous EWIN, and I'll explain why it is infamous and what is an EWIN. Well, so an EWIN is an early warning indicator notice. Prior to the RSA intrusion in 2011, US-CERT predominantly put out products in two forms: very bite-sized, easily digestible bits of guidance that was meant for public consumption, and then other documents that went out to predominantly government agencies. The problem was those government documents were long. They were really in-depth pieces of analysis. And that wasn't actually the problem. The problem was doing those longer documents required a lot more work through, peer review, approvals, and that sort of thing. So from the time you observed something, wrote up your analysis of it, and published it out, it could be a couple of weeks. Not exactly ideal. So the feedback we were getting from government agencies was, we need this faster. So hence this early warning indicator notice. It was just basically, here's the indicators, maybe a two-sentence blurb about what it was about, and it went out to the agencies. That worked, but it was still a PDF, and not exactly the ideal thing if you're then trying to take that information and put it into another system, but still a better evolution of it. We could get the EWIN out in a matter of 20 minutes after a supervisor approved it, off it went. But it was still intended mostly for a government audience. With the RSA intrusion, things really flipped really fast. Remember I mentioned that US-CERT didn't do incident response when I first came on board. The RSA intrusion ended up being about the second actual incident response we had ever done. The first one was an intrusion into the NASDAQ. So it was also the first time as a government we had learned how to do a multi-agency response, the intelligence community, law enforcement, and the US-CERT element from DHS. So this was our second go at really responding as a government, and because the victims for this thing extended well beyond government, you know, any number of private sector entities had RSA tokens and were at risk as a result of that breach. So we had an interesting conundrum. We didn't have any information products that were really intended for that audience. We had our EWIN structure, but that was targeted towards government. And every one of those products had a classification marking on it. Traditionally, you might see it as unclassified / FOUO, for official use only. And that's really meant for, you know, in government channels. It's a way of marking something that says, hey, this normally should not be given out as a part of a freedom of information request. If something has that marking, that it needs a secondary review for that. But here we are putting that out for a broader audience. Still not meant to go out on a public website, certainly. The challenge is when you tell someone it's for official use only, and the government agency we're giving it to is a regulatory agency for private sector, what constitutes official use? Can they give it to those entities that they regulate in the private sector? That's an official use, but traditionally you don't take those documents and distribute them outside of government. We were kind of caught by surprise because one of those entities, the Office of the Comptroller of Currency, part of the Treasury, put it out on a website meant for their constituency. And so it became infamous as an EWIN because suddenly it was out there very publicly in a way that we couldn't control. And if you'll notice, there's an A after the end of that number, that 11-007A. That's a revision. Well, if we don't control where it goes, how it gets out there, and how do we get a new update out to them? How do we make sure everyone knows that there's a new update to those versioning? So that turned into a problem. And keep in mind, I said that this incident was the second time that as a whole of government we had come together to work in intrusion. One of the concerns from law enforcement, of course, is they don't want to burn, and the intelligence community, they don't want to burn any of their equities. They don't want to tip their hand to the bad guy and say what we know about them. So the last thing you want to do is put all these indicators in a document and publish it on the internet. So that was our first fight, was whether or not we could even put this information together into a document to distribute it out. And then it ends up on the internet after all. So one of the things that law enforcement and the intel community said is, hey, look, this victim has actually multiple intrusion actors that are targeting them all the time. So there's a whole bunch of indicators of badness, IOCs, that we can put together, including the very specific ones for this incident, but we'll put them all together in one giant document. We'll bury them in the noise of a whole lot of known good, high quality indicators of compromise, but we're just going to bury it amongst all of that and not call out the very specific ones. And this was a reasonable compromise at the time because, hey, it's all indicators of badness. It's not going to cause harm to anyone who receives this, and if they see an alert in one of their systems, it really is a bad thing, so not a problem. The interesting thing was, and this is where more of that infamy comes in, researchers started to rely on this document as a basis for doing attribution. They looked at it and said that if you had any match against this activity, any of these indicators, it was all the same actor, because they didn't know the backstory that this EWIN actually had multiple actors, multiple intrusion actors in the same document. So they start doing research based off of a bad assumption, and they have no way to cross-check that. So that turned into an interesting thing. And I mentioned, our distribution channels for this was really a challenge. So how do we get updates out to people? Prior to 2015 timeframe, USCERT pretty much all the time stayed away from doing attribution. This is important. Personally, this is kind of one of my soapbox items. I think that most CERT organizations, national level CERT organizations, should be kind of like the Cyber Red Cross. Don't pick sides in the battle, just worry about the victims, get information out there. That's your thing. You're helping victims of a cyber incident, that's it. Don't worry about who it is that's in the mix on either side. So overall, USCERT has stayed along those lines, but others have relied on that information to do their own attribution. And as late as 2013, you'd see this all the time. And then I found an article, or a presentation rather, from someone at RSA and EMC in 2014. And so they say the general list of command and control domains for the RSA attack were published in a longer list, and they referenced that USCERT EWIN, the early revision, not the later one, because they didn't have access to it. And then they call out and say, hey, the important domains in that were relevant for the specific activity, and they name which ones those were. Really, out of 23 indicators, only 4 in that document were actually relevant to that specific intrusion actor. So as far as 2014, people were still mixing up the attribution around it, and this was the first time that someone called it out and said, these things are really two different animals in the same document. I mentioned, the naming convention, EWINs, were that result of, we used to do these long-winded documents. We got into this cycle of if we didn't get it out there fast, the information wasn't as useful. And that's still true today. There's even more growing pressure today that information isn't useful for very long. If you take a hash of a piece of malware, minutes, hours later in some cases, that hash really isn't as relevant anymore because the intrusion actors have already updated their malware and so on. But this was really that first phase of understanding that we need to get this stuff out there faster, but the lesson learned is that we need a better distribution channel for it. And then the markings. Markings on documents really is where things took a different change. We get traffic light protocol. So who here uses or is aware of the traffic light protocol? Not everyone's hand's going up. Okay, so imagine a traffic light. It's got 3 primary colors on it: red, yellow, and green. Basically just a simple way of telling people how freely they can distribute the information out. Red, that means that generally speaking, I'm giving that information to a person. They may not distribute it beyond themselves without my consent. Yellow, I can give it to you and you can distribute it to anyone in your organization that has a need for that information. And then green, you can distribute it freely anywhere you believe there's a need for it, but not do so publicly. And then later on, you see the addition of white to that, which means distribute it wherever you want, including on public-facing websites. That would have solved our markings and expectations for that EWIN. USCERT didn't create the traffic light protocol, but USCERT certainly took a heavy usage of it and definitely pushed it forward pretty quickly because of all the documents that they started marking with it. It still creates an interesting problem, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Sticks and taxi. This is where we start to get into speeding up that distribution of the information a little bit. In theory, sticks is just a way of creating structured threat intelligence information, just structure around it, making so that it's machine readable. It's essentially XML under the hood. In earlier versions, JSON in more recent implementations. Because the ability then is just to feed it into a piece of software, have it ingest it, and start searching for things. When we were distributing EWINs, there were PDFs that required an analyst to open up that PDF, highlight stuff, copy and paste, and copying and pasting never leads to errors. It never leads to omission of characters or the inclusion of a null character at the beginning of something, an odd tab or whatever else. Never happens. So the idea was to have a way of having just machine-readable information. Speeds things up. That means that, hey, everything will be just that much faster and more accurate. Then you have taxi, which then allows machine-to-machine communication. A system can subscribe to a feed, automatically pull that information down, ingest it, and take action. If you start talking about this to senior leaders, they start to get the mistaken impression that this means that you can take the human out of the loop. This means that I can just have machines automatically ingest this information and take action like blocking things. Until the first time someone publishes an indicator that happens to be for one of your own IP addresses and you just blocked yourself, or a key business partner, or it is a hash for a legitimate file. Any number of other things that can cause a problem. And that's really the other piece of this. It's a garbage in, garbage out kind of a problem. It just speeds up how quickly you get the garbage delivered to you. That's kind of the reality of things. Structured formats, sharing forums. So ISACs and ISOWs. ISOWs are a newer kind of creation or an iteration on ISACs. Information Sharing and Analysis Centers. It wouldn't be government if you didn't have lots of acronyms, by the way. So information and sharing and analysis centers are generally set up along industry verticals. You have the FS ISAC, the Financial Services ISAC. You have an energy sector ISAC, and so on. This allows us to be a little more flexible with information sharing. You don't have to go to each individual consumer of information and get the information out there. You just need to get it to their ISAC. They can get it out to their members. This creates a problem, though, for traditional understanding of traffic light protocol. If you recall, traffic light protocol says that if I share it with you, you can share it inside your organization. Well, if your organization is an ISAC, you can only send it around inside the ISAC, but not necessarily to your members of the ISAC. So it became an interpretation problem. You know, people get a little pedantic with things, and they wanted clarification. So there have been some tweaks and modifications with the understanding what TLP is. The form of incident response and security teams has taken on an endeavor around being the steward of TLP to kind of keep those things clarified. And that's helped so that now people understand, generally speaking, that if it's TLP Amber and you're giving it to a sharing organization whose entire purpose is to distribute out to their members, that it's going to get distributed out to those members as well. The other issue is, okay, so I give you a whole host of indicators. Give you a whole bunch of them, and it's timely information. You need to go search for it. It's all fine and good, but if you don't have the infrastructure on the other end of it to consume that information and then go search for those indicators, you're going to have a problem. And a classic example of this in government was the US Office of Personnel Management, or OPM. It's basically human resources on steroids for the government. They also happen to hold all of the security clearance information for basically the majority of government employees. And all of that data was exposed. I got to work that intrusion while I was still in government. I also was in the middle of my 5-year periodic review of my clearance. That meant that I had to update my information in that database. So a little aside on that, it was painful because our personnel security office couldn't be told about the breach. We needed to keep the number of people that were aware of it to a minimum. The number of people across all of government that really knew and understood what was going on with that breach was quite small until it was public. And each agency's personnel security office couldn't be told. So I waited as long as I could, trying not to update my information in that database, just trying. And then they finally emailed me and said, look, you have until the end of day tomorrow or we're going to suspend your clearance. So I kind of sat at my keyboard almost crying to myself, and then I realized, well, all I'm doing is updating maybe 3 pieces of information in this database. If the adversary's already got it, all I'm giving them is 3 little minor updates, so not really a big loss for me. But just the realization that I could be handing my information off knowingly just rubbed me the wrong way. But back onto the topic, we had a host of indicators, hundreds of indicators that came out of that intrusion, and we tasked federal agencies and said, hey, you need to go take these and search your environment, knowing what type of a tall order this is going to be. Can you imagine giving people 30 days to take action on something that's urgent and saying, hey, go search your environment for these indicators? We know the indicators are perishable. Time-wise, it's an urgent matter, but we're going to give you 30 days to do it because we know already that most of you can't execute on this in real time. At the end of the 30 days, the vast majority of agencies came back and with a shoulder shrug and said, yeah, we tried, couldn't touch most of our systems, had no real way of searching in a centralized repository to even just search against our logs. So they just it was a shoulder shrug. They said, this is great, we tried, but we really couldn't search for most of it. A couple agencies, very few actually came back with definitive answers, said, we touched all of our endpoints that we know about and could touch, and here's those numbers, here's what we think we missed, and no hits in our environment. I think there was 2 agencies that came back that way. The rest was mostly that shoulder shrug. So yeah, if you have all this data, it's wonderful, but if you don't have a way of consuming it in a meaningful way, you're kind of up a creek. CDM is the Continuous Diagnostics and Mitigation Program that DHS is doing. Basically what it is a giant pot of money with some program management around it to structure security programs for agencies and initially provide funding to those agencies to go and buy from a menu of solutions at each phase of the program. And then in the second or third years and out years of the program, it's up to the agencies to pay for the ongoing maintenance and subscription for whatever they bought in that first part that DHS paid for in the first year. Coming up, there's a phase 3 for that includes EDR, so endpoint detection and response capabilities. So after multiple years of this CDM program, we're finally getting to that phase where, in theory, you can now reach out to those endpoints and maybe run this long list of indicators against them and start to have that effect that you're desired for. But in government, everything goes slowly. We're finally getting close to the end of that tunnel. All right, so in theory, many years have gone by. We should have learned all of our lessons from the infamous EWIN and everything else. And then late 2015, early 2016 comes along and we have Grizzly Step. So this was related to the US election, the alleged Russian interference in elections, and the code name for it was called Grizzly Step. That document that was released was a disaster in more ways than I think any of us can count. First of all, the first bad thing about it was US-CERT actually went out and put out their name on a document that included attribution in it. So US-CERT was lending its name and putting out attribution. First thing that, to me anyway, violates that cardinal rule. They should have just stuck with the technical indicators, put it out as a companion thing, and that's traditionally what would happen, even before I left government, would be US-CERT would put out a document that in almost all ways was identical to what, say, FBI would put out. The difference would be there'd be a section FBI would add that would have the attribution piece. Because just keeping them separate, getting out of that argument about who did it and whether or not the indicators are sufficient proof of who did it is an important thing. If all you're trying to do is warn people that something bad might be happening on your network, use these indicators and go look for it, don't get into the distracting piece of the discussion of who did it, which is actually what ended up happening with this document. More and more people were trying to battle back and forth that it really wasn't the Russians, it was really this bunch of criminal actors, rather than discussing whether or not the indicators were being found someplace and whether that meant that networks were being attacked. The other problem was it was rushed out the door. This document was very clearly rushed out the door because of the number of errors that were in it. There were IPs that weren't malicious. One of the IPs in it mapped to the Microsoft.com telemetry site. So your Windows 10 installation sends certain telemetry information back. That IP was in there. There was, I believe, the IP for a null file in there. Do you want to guess how many null files, basically empty files, are on disk on any given machine? Lots. So you can imagine the number of false positives you get if you give people that hash and say, go search for that. And many other things like that. The document lacked context. It lacked the ability to tell you, hey, if you see this very low confidence indicator combined with this other low confidence indicator, combined with this low confidence indicator, then you might have a problem, and still need to look for one of these other two indicators to gain higher confidence. Instead, what people did is they just took all of those indicators, treated them equally, and searched their environment for all of them. And if any one of them hit, they set off the alarm bells, and they turned it into a fire drill of epic proportions. So that's a problem that we still have. We don't have a good way of expressing confidence in indicators individually and combining them in a meaningful way so that people can build a higher confidence out of a bunch of lower confidence things. There are indications that that document initially contained indicators from multiple actors. That sound familiar? Sound like something maybe we did in 2011? But the problem with that is back then, we weren't doing attribution. We weren't adding a blame to someone. And in this case, you're putting out a document that has possibly multiple actors in it, and you're putting attribution to it. So now you're pouring gasoline on this already big debate about whether it proves that one actor did something or didn't do something by conflating indicators from multiple actors in one document. More distraction. And in this case, this was a case where there was a huge push by government to declassify information. There were a number of things that came out of that that were rapidly declassified and get it out there very, very quickly. Under normal circumstances, that's something to be lauded in government. When government actually moves quickly to declassify something and get it out there for public consumption, that's a good thing. In this case, because they pushed it so fast, and arguably somewhat for political reasons, that ended up with a less than optimal product. Lots of mistakes in it, a lot of issues. One thing that people don't understand when you're dealing, especially in the classified realms, there's an equities review process. Essentially, when you have multiple intelligence organizations in the mix, there's a proposal to declassify a particular piece of information, and it's sent around the ring of different agencies to get their approval or consent or their objections, maybe, to releasing that document. And this coordination process takes time every time you do it. So it also creates a disincentive when there's political pressure to get it out the door yesterday. If someone spots a mistake in it, everyone's going to look at it and say, yeah, you know what, if we correct this mistake, we're going to have to go back through all the agencies to coordinate again and get their consent again. So we'll publish it out as is. We'll worry about fixing the mistakes later. That's great if all you're trying to do is meet a political objective or pressure from politicals so they get off your back, but it's not great if you're trying to have people take meaningful action on this information and also build a trustworthy intelligence sharing program with the public for the future, right? If they can't trust you each time you push something out, they're probably going to be slower to act on the information you put out the next time. All right, I had to make the pun about bearable, sorry. There was one critique after another. Sands blog put out their critiques of the DHS and FBI Grizzly Step report, reflections on Grizzly Step, Tenable, which was interesting. They urged more language, different language in it. Some of it was actually around some of the attribution and being more pointed about attribution rather than talking about the errors necessarily in the document. Probably the most even-handed piece of criticism came from Robert M. Lee. His was a lot more pragmatic. It was very constructive critique of things. He offered guidance on where it could have been improved, where their errors were, and so on. So his was probably the best of all the critiques that I did see. This one was a little brutal. Grizzly Step report fails to assist. Grizzly misstep. Hacking report poorly done, fatally flawed. And then you get into the part where things really just kind of took on a life of their own. People started using those indicators, looking around environments, and they found badness where maybe it really didn't exist, such as an electrical company, where they had a laptop for someone who wasn't on the grid control networks or anything else, and they had some hit for some indicator, not necessarily the full complement of hits. They would indicate that you had a full-blown intrusion, just one or two things that fired off. But of course, once that information gets out there, the press takes a hold of it, and it gets a life of its own. Vermont utility finds alleged Russian malware on computer. Did they really? All right, so turning the corner from that, and what lessons did we learn from that one? US-CERT turned around and did something in reverse. Remember I said they used to have these longer-winded products that led us to do EWINs, which eventually turned into publishing information in STIX format and getting it out through TAXI. What ended up happening is US-CERT said, nuts with this. We're actually going to largely skip the interagency process, and we're just going to write our own analytic product. So they did. They wrote an in-depth analytic product that was akin to this old stuff that we used to write years ago that takes a longer time to do, get the peer reviews done on it just internally, and they put it out there. And lo and behold, the community turned around and said, why didn't you give this to us in the first place? This is correct, this is accurate. It gives us a lot more context so we can understand the threat and understand what the meaning of these indicators are. It had appendices that went through all sorts of information. And so you start to see people thoughtfully going through that product and giving the praise that it deserved. Oh, and I happen to know some of the folks behind pushing out this product. I was kind of privately texting a bunch of them at the time saying, look, better to ask for forgiveness. You guys did a lot of damage by just hopping to the political drum on this and getting out that first product. You need to get out something that's a little bit better. Ask for forgiveness later, but just go write something that's what you should have wrote the first time and get it out there. And that's exactly what they did. They kind of published something out, and then everyone else kind of quietly in government went, okay. And they walked away from it rather than make a big deal about the fact that they didn't ask for permission on that one, because it was the right type of information to get out there. This report differs from the first and is not as much an update, rather a companion. The report does not suffer from the same problems in the first release. The first release tried to satisfy a poorly executed joint statement and satisfy a range of audiences, mixing geopolitical topics with technical details. Isn't that what I said? Yeah. Basically, someone else on the outside looking in said that product, the original product, was just so fatally flawed because of the mixed messaging, the different audiences that were being targeted, and the different reasons for putting out the product. And they recognized that US-CERT, when they did this second product, avoided all of those pitfalls. The quality of this report is much higher, potentially illustrating more care and learning the lessons of the first reports. And then DHS falls right back into it. I say this with love. Like I said, I came from there. I love the mission. I continue to support them. But the Automated Indicator Sharing program has a long way to go. So AIS is nothing more than DHS's instance of a taxi server. It's meant to automate that machine-to-machine piece of getting information distributed very quickly so that, in theory, people can ingest it and take actions on it quickly on their end. The problem is it's still a garbage in, garbage out kind of a situation. DHS's program has minimal vetting. The vetting for this information is almost entirely focused on preventing personally identifiable information from being distributed as a part of those indicators. It's to comply with Privacy Act and other restrictions in law and nothing else. There are no technical vetting of those indicators. They don't look for loopback IP address. They don't look for the null hash that you might see come through. So minimal bits of vetting for technical accuracy don't even make it into the mix. They don't run, say, legitimate binaries against known whitelists that other parts of government create, like the NSRL. NIST publishes massive whitelists of hashes of known good files called the NSRL. There's a number of other whitelists out there, but they could take every hash they get and run it against that list and not publish that as an indicator of compromise because, well, by itself, it's not. It's a legitimate file that could be on disk somewhere. They published Tor exit node IPs in that, because that was in the Grizzly Step product, and guess what got pushed into AIS? That first release of all the bad set of indicators that was part of Grizzly Step got pushed through AIS to anyone that consumed that data feed. And pretty much anyone in the world can consume the DHS AIS feed. I know Japan consumes it. I know other countries at their level consume it, and private sector across a number of other countries consume that information. It's high volume data with a pretty high noise ratio with it as well. So that's another issue with the information. And you can't distinguish the types of threats. So in that volume of data, I might have commodity malware, I might have privacy invading types of malware or potentially unwanted programs, or I might have nation state activity. And if I, as a consumer of that threat intel, don't know which is which, and it alerts, it just says I have this somewhere in my environment, how do I begin to prioritize my alerting and my tasking of my SOC? How do I tell them which of those alerts to go after first? I can't. So it becomes hard to consume this data. If you're a federal agency within the US, you talk to the same server, but you get two feeds of information. There's a high quality, high fidelity stream of information that's for only federal agencies, and the larger bulk of information that AIS gives out pretty much to anyone. The problem is, it's the same feed. So as you log in as a federal agency, it's commingled into one data stream. So you just took this really high fidelity thing and just slipstreamed it into all the other noise. Kind of defeats the purpose. Taxi does have the ability to have multiple sets of collections that you can explicitly subscribe to if you're authorized, and that way agencies could pick and choose from that. So there's still a lot of room to improve in this data feed. One critique of it, the problem according to Chernin is that those caveats were not included in the Grizzly Step data that was loaded into AIS. Without that context, we can't know what to do with the data. Exactly. The Office of the Inspector General, this is an interesting element in all of the federal agencies. There's an Inspector General in each agency, and frankly, their job is to find bad things. Mismanagement, whatever. It's almost as if they haven't done their job if they don't write an incredibly negative report at least once a quarter and put it in the press and send a copy to Congress. Rather than necessarily being constructive about what they're finding and helping agencies improve, sometimes they can lose their way just like the agency can. This was an example, I think, of cherry-picking data in a way that was a little bit unfair to the AIS. One agency representative told the IG that DHS provided all these indicators and only 2 or 3 of those indicators were found to be malicious and related to cyber events. My guess is what the meaning behind that was is that that agency found 2 or 3 events as a result of the AIS data. But the absence of finding something doesn't mean that the data didn't have value. It just meant that the intersection between those indicators and the malicious actors behind them and the actors that were targeting that agency wasn't that great. I mean, that's all that really meant. It doesn't mean that the indicators themselves didn't have value. It just depends on what agency you are and what your threat picture is and whether or not those indicators necessarily apply to you at that given time. So I thought this was interesting just because it was a cherry picking of a data point and a phrasing that seems to make it sound incredibly inefficient and not useful. Frankly, it has its problems. I don't necessarily agree that it's that bad. All right, like I said, it's not all bad. USCERT has made considerable progress in this. They've worked with the international community to continue to move things forward. Use of TLP through their efforts and funding with MITRE, the taxi and sticks feeds, or standards. And then in 2015, they transitioned that off to a separate standards body that's publicly run under OASIS. If any of you are interested in shaping that process, engaging with OASIS, independent of DHS, is how you do that. So they started it, they funded it, and then they handed it off to a public standards body and stepped away from that. They still participate, but they're not the lead. Despite all of the mistakes, most of the commentary around those mistakes have been constructive, and that's what's necessary. If all we do is bash people and say that they're stupid or they should have known better, we're not going to get better about this. They'll stop listening to that feedback. If a formal method doesn't work, find an informal one, like find a coworker or colleague and text them and say, hey, you guys really need to get another product out there. Here's the issues that we see with this thing. Find other channels to get that feedback to them. So if you're going to go and start consuming a feed, what should you expect from a provider of that feed? Understand, and they should be able to tell you, what types of threats are generally going to be covered in that threat intel feed. Are you going to see spyware, crimeware, or nation-state related information in that feed? Or all three of those things, right? So you need to have a conversation with them. What type of information do they collect? Or do they even break it out in that way? What types of reviews do they do on that data? Is it a fully manual review? Is it a manual review with some automated minimal QAing to take away the null hashes and loopback IPs and other common things? Is it a fully automated feed with just the minimal QAing? And what is it good for? Can I take this data and reliably push it out to my endpoints and search for those indicators of compromise? Or is the data so high volume that the only way I can look for it is to periodically mash it against my SIM? Or is it really only good for science projects and data analytics products, or maybe doing threat intel research where I'm also doing my own attribution work? So understanding what their data feed is suitable for using. How often do they update it? How often do they send out corrections when they do find an issue in that feed? Can they express confidence in the indicators? Is there somewhere in there that they're expressing their own confidence in those indicators? Can they express confidence in the source of the data that they're receiving? So if there's a regular contributor, can that source be given a kind of a score so that over time, anything that comes from them tends to have a confidence score with it as well? And a feedback process is critical. Can you, as a consumer of that data, get something back to them to tell them, hey, there's errors in this, or hey, we need more clarity on something, maybe even providing your own scoring of how useful you found that particular piece of information.